Secret Group 13 with Ukraine's defense intelligence used their Magura V7 to take down two Su-30 over the Black Sea.
What an amazing example of Ukrainian innovation on the battlefield. Just a phenomenal success. If you get a warning, in some respects, it's giving you advance warning you're going to die. Ukraine will not win this war with a straight force-on-force fight. You know, that will favour the bigger party. It has to use innovation. So it's not like James Bond stepping off in his suit and just stepping off a step. You hit the ground.
Whee! Let's go on the ride.
How does that go again?
Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko. You're watching my podcast. This is the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. Unless I can't resist and grab something from the newsfeed and discuss it with my guest. Of course, I couldn't ignore what historically happened over the Black Sea and when Secret Group 13 took down two Su-30. Historical moment, unprecedented, and especially if you follow me for quite some time, you know the Commander Group 13 was on this podcast and he was absolutely amazing. It's the person with heart of a lion and soul of a poet. So I leave the link to this interview right here. You will see the link and also under this video in the description, and please click, enjoy. He's amazing. So today we will discuss Su-30, which jumped or were made to drown in the Black Sea with the best person for this. It's Sean Bell, ex-fighter jet pilot, one of the top speakers on Ukraine in the UK, and the podcaster. And I suspect you're going to be smashed with his charisma, sense of humor, and his intelligence, the same as I did before. It's second time for Sean on the podcast, and I hope it's one of many, many more, because we always have a lot things to discuss. And also I'll leave link to Sean podcast in the description so you can have more of him and enjoy. Sean, hello, how are you today?
Jenny, it's always a pleasure. It's a beautiful sunny day outside, and after that introduction, I hope we have a good chat.
Well, of course. So the news came through. Historical moment. Secret Group 13 with Ukraine's defense intelligence used their Magura V7 to take down two Su-30 over the Black Sea. Your emotions and your thinking behind that.
Yeah, I mean, originally when I heard the news, I was somewhat skeptical because the Su-30s are a pretty advanced Russian aircraft. They are normally pretty well defended. And if you look at what we know, that a naval drone with missiles on board taking out a modern fighter jet doesn't sound remotely feasible. And gradually more and more news came out about it. Because the V7s are pretty substantial little boat, but largely it's used tech full of explosives and drive it straight at Russian shipping, and that's been where it's been most effective. And I had to do a bit of research about this because they have been trialing mounting missiles on these boats, and the picture I saw was actually an old Sidewinder missile, which we used to fly in the Royal Air Force. We can get into that as we go. But you just went, okay, how do they aim it? It was difficult enough aiming it. When I was in my fighter jet, we used to fire one of them every 2 years to make sure that we knew how it all worked, that we could actually go through the switchgear to actually gain confidence the missile could hit a target. And it was largely again in an Aberporth range, I believe, and we'd have a an unmanned drone that was towing a flare pack, and it would light that up and you would fire the missile. But you had to be really careful to aim it. And you imagine these missiles mounted on a little boat that's bouncing around like mad in the ocean. I just couldn't understand how they did it. But it does appear not only the two SU-30s, but also the helicopter as well. One of the crews apparently of the Su-30 survived, one did not. And again, we can get into that. But what an amazing example of Ukrainian innovation on the battlefield. Just a phenomenal success.
Oh, yeah, it is. And you mentioned being skeptical. I think skeptical is one of your words, especially on this podcast. It's very much, but it's good because it attracts other people who's very skeptical about things. And I love seeing this big discussion. You mentioned this kind of like the moment of calculations and hitting the target, but it's not just a challenge for those operators of the drones and missiles to hit the jet, but also preparing for this interview, I was discussing sort of like these peculiarities of this kind of fight with one of Ukrainians pilot who is trained for F-16, and he was saying it's actually quite difficult to hit those little boats because it's being in a jet is one thing, but actually seeing this target and hit the target, because it feels like Russians send those jets because they're desperate, they're helpless. The Black Sea is there and they can't control it. Would you agree that this is a challenge for pilots to hit boats?
Yeah, it is, but some of that you need to get into the dynamics of how pilots see the world, because generally speaking, a pilot is sat in $100 million aircraft that is significant capabilities, and it's all about situational awareness. And the pilot, he might spend only 3 or 4 years in training to become combat ready, but when he does arrive on a squadron combat ready, he's the worst pilot on the squadron. And it generally takes another 3-6 years before you are remotely competent at doing your job. And it's not because these guys are rubbish, it's just because it's so difficult to do. Now, one of the sensors that you have in the cockpit is the radar. And the radar obviously is designed to look for air threats. That's predominantly what your radar is there for, because if you didn't select just air threats, the radar would ping off everything that gave a return everywhere in the world. And so every car, every lorry, every house. So you'd be looking at a radar screen that was just completely full. So the way radars work is they ignore things below a certain speed, so that that way you don't get cars picked up, you don't get. So generally, I mean, I don't know that for the modern radars, but generally speaking, you set a gate, which is the minimum speed, because most of your flying threats are going to be at least 200 or 300 miles an hour, if not significantly faster. Why is that important? It's because the V7 and other little sea drones are normally operating at about 40 to 50 knots maximum. So therefore, they're about the speed of a car. I admit you wouldn't have a car on the sea, but even so, it means that the radars just don't pick them up, particularly because they won't necessarily all be metal anyway. They'll be quite small, but they're going much slower than the radar is set to pick up. The other thing to point out, obviously, is that if we're doing a classic dogfight between aircraft, basically you want to see the other aircraft as early as possible. So you have a good radar, but also if you've got stealth, it means he can't see you before you get close. But it's all about radar technologies and pinging around the airspace. These missiles that were fired from the Magura are infrared missiles. They don't need to have a radar at all. All they're doing is looking and watching. They're picking up a heat signature and passively chasing that heat signature, so that the pilot in the cockpit, if you were firing a radar missile, he'd know that the enemy were looking at you because he could hear the radar. He'd know when the missile was in the air because there's a different tone coming into your headset. Whereas if you're firing an infrared missile, which is purely passive, it's not sending any details, any information out itself, it's literally just homing in on the infrared signature, you don't know about it. And that's the beauty of these infrared missiles. That's the beauty of the Magura attack, is that the Russian pilots probably didn't even know they were being targeted at the time.
So there was surprise.
Absolutely. And they probably were in the part of the world where they would not have expected to be targeted. And therefore, yeah, the first they'd have known about it was when one of the wingmen got blown up. And all of a sudden, the other one would have gone, what the hell happened there? And then they would have been attacked as well.
So you would agree they're quite desperate, sending those. I've heard this expression about this jet. It's castle on the winds or something. So they're sending castles to shoot some tiny cheap boats. Would it be a sign of being desperate and helpless in the Black Sea?
I think we've got to be careful here, Jenny. I think that it's a really good example of where Ukraine has used innovation and technology to just cause Russia to think twice. The shooting down of two SU-30s is not going to change the course of the war. Russia will have learnt its lessons, but it does mean that if you can launch these missiles off a small boat, you can also launch them off the back of a flatbed truck. And it means, therefore, that these missiles could actually be anywhere. Now, normally, when you fire a Sidewinder missile, every time I've flown one, your jet is doing at least 400 miles an hour at the time. So the missile already has a lot of flying speed when it leaves the rails. When you are firing them off a little boat, it's got no flying speed at all. So actually, the danger is for the test firings is these things go whoosh and plop straight into the water. But I think the fantastic thing is if you were trying to develop this in the West, you'd have to do flight trials, there'd have to be safety cases, there'd have to be months, maybe even years of test and development to allow this to happen. Ukraine doesn't need to do that. Some guy can wake up in the morning and go, do you know, I've got an idea. We might be able to put these missiles onto a little boat, and everybody would look at them like they looked at Barnes Wallis trying to talk through a bouncing bomb in the Second World War and going, you must be mad. And they go, okay, give it a go. And they did, and it worked. And I think that itself is a really, really clever way, because Ukraine will not win this war with a straight force on force fight. That will favor the bigger party. It has to use innovation, has to use surprise, has to use deception. And I think this is a great example of that.
Well, it is the war with David and Goliath, isn't it? So it's like we like it or not, but it is. Do you think while they were sort of the Ukrainian team, while they were working on this operation, they should have the pilot among them to understand, to explain them sort of like which are the strong bits of this jet can become its weaknesses? As you mentioned, the speed slowed down, sort of like um, it's got lower from the ground. So all those things which would be this strength of the jet became its weaknesses, isn't it? And probably pilot didn't have chance to escape when he realized that sort of something happened.
No, and I do think I mean, one of the things that the danger here is that I'm not inside the intelligence loop. So understanding all the details of what happened, the preparation, the actual situation. Therefore, I have to look at it from a pilot's perspective and say, okay, if you are using Sidewinder missiles, the pilots wouldn't have had any warning this coming up. But therefore, where do you get the Sidewinders from? And we've got a lot of Sidewinder missiles in the UK that are running out of life that you either just get rid of. Generally speaking, those missiles wouldn't be any use to Ukraine because they are infrared missiles, so they hunt a heat signature. You've got to be relatively close to the other aircraft, certainly within a few miles, for the missile to pick up the heat signature. Now, most of the military engagements with aircraft are done 100, 200 miles apart. They're not done really, really close. And therefore, given the Ukraine is at a disadvantage when it comes to air power, the last thing Ukraine will want to do is get its aircraft close enough to a Russian aircraft to use one of these infrared missiles. So generally speaking, I would have thought, okay, there'll be no use to Ukraine. What seems to have happened, though, is that with pilots in the loop, with your special forces, with your innovation teams in Ukraine, they've gone, how do we seduce the Russians into targeting these little boats that they can then fire back? And I say, for me, one of the big questions here is when I used to have the aircraft with one of these missiles on board, there was wiring through to the missile, which means I could listen to the tone of the missile. In other words, as it was looking for a heat signature, I would see a circle rotating in my head-up display, which was where the missile was looking. And I would rest that circular pattern around my target, and then I would unlock the missile. When I heard a tone that meant that the missile could see something there, I would then unlock the missile. The missile would then lock on to that heat signature, and it would either go wobbling off or it would stay there. If it stayed there, I could now make the switches live in the cockpit and fire the missile off. Now, all of that took some time, and as I say, you had to rest this reticule around the target. Very difficult to see how you're going to do that when the little boat's bouncing around on the water. So there's lots of unanswered questions in my head about how this was actually pulled together. So it isn't just about firing a missile from a small speedboat, and there is a little bit more to it than that. And that's what I admire about the Ukrainian innovation, because it worked.
As a pilot, did you feel shivers on your back when you found out that is actually this thing's possible and felt sorry for the colleagues, or you didn't have any of those emotions like, yes, for Ukraine?
Well, yeah, I can imagine your enthusiasm, Jenny. The trouble is, I've got a lot of grey hair here. I'm a more seasoned campaigner, so I think that the enthusiasm. Don't get me wrong. It's a great tactical success for Ukraine, but if you step back from that tactical success, strategically, Ukraine's in trouble at the moment. Ukraine is in trouble on the battlefields. It's in trouble in terms of international support. And therefore, I'm always a little bit wary about where successes lie. And it's a bit like the drones, the number of times that drones have been used very successfully by Ukraine, and a lot is made of that. Is it actually changing the course of the war, though? Probably not. And I think, therefore, that is one area where I certainly didn't feel sorry for the pilots. I do think the one thing that we've got from the West is we do a lot of training. We train in exercises like Red Flag. We spend a lot of time making sure our pilots are the best they can be. Russian pilots are not traditionally exposed to that level of training, and therefore they won't have some of the situational awareness and the skills which we take for granted in the West. But this was an example where we do have on modern aircraft a missile approach warning system, so that even though the missile itself isn't emitting a warning to tell you it's on its way, we do have a sort of a way of detecting missiles coming in. The trouble is most missiles come in at a couple of times the speed of sound, and therefore you don't have long before they're going to impact you. So if you get a warning, in some respects, it's giving you an advance warning you're going to die. Rather than here's what you can do about it. I am interested, though. Obviously, one of the crews did survive, and it sounds like they ejected. I, having ejected myself out of a military jet, that's quite an experience, which they would not have expected to have. And I was really interested to know where they landed, because if they landed anywhere near Ukrainian territory, then they would not have been looking forward to the reception they got when they landed.
Absolutely. And is it true? Because for me, it was quite surprised when I came across this facts when you sort of like ejection from the plane. It's not sort of like, wee, let's go on the ride. It's actually can
Go
be.
again? How does that go again?
Well, I was sort of like trying to portray the excitement because, like we're going on the ride and it's like, hey, or it's just, it can be quite fatal. And actually, injury-wise, it's not something you're looking forward to, is it?
No, and it's not a moment at all. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the first of all, is it dangerous? Not really. I'd be careful about the Top Gun type analogy. Um, but it's not. It is designed to save your life. It's not designed to leave you injury free. A couple of reasons for that. One of which is that it's got to get you under a parachute. So from the moment you pull the ejection handle, you might be traveling at 600 miles an hour. Within a second and a half, it wants to get you under a parachute. So it's got to happen very quickly, because if you're close to the ground, it's the only way to survive. So it's quite a brutal ride. The original ejection seats were basically a bomb. You pull the handle on a bomb, and they worked out the size of the bomb. It would give you a 50 g acceleration. So you would weigh 50 times your weight today. That would crush your spine, and you'd be left with about half an inch off your height after the ejection. And a lot of people were injured by that. At the same time, the canopy either gets ejected, or in my case, it gets exploded. It's covered with the miniature detonating cord, and it explodes. And then as the seat goes up the rails, you go from the quiet confines of a cockpit to suddenly being blasted by 500-mile-an-hour wind. The seat leaves the cockpit, the seat falls away, a drogue pops out, that then pulls the main parachute out, and you are swing below the parachute, and suddenly you're left at working out what's happened. Now, the more modern ejection seats, rather than just having this single bomb with 50 g, they are now a rocket seat. So they have an initial bang, an initial explosion of about 25 g, half the explosive, which doesn't generally leave you losing any height afterwards. And then then as you move up the rails, it pulls a rocket pack, and that rocket pack fires, giving you another 25 g surge, and therefore it spreads the burden out over a slightly longer period of time to get you out of the cockpit. It's still a brutal ride. You still go through the shards of the canopy exploding. You're still literally thrown into the air. And when you land, after my landing, there was blood everywhere, and you sort of go, look, your adrenaline is pumping and everything. In fact, I was lucky. It was literally, I just chopped over my face a bit, and I was fine. But it is worth remembering that the parachutes, they've got to be packed into a relatively small space in the ejection seat, so that you come down quite fast. You hit the ground, so it's not like James Bond stepping off in his suit and just stepping off a step. You hit the ground as if you jumped off the top of a double-decker bus. That's the speed in which you hit the ground. And on a standard day in Germany, it would be about 25 knots of wind, so about 30 miles an hour of wind. So if I said to you, Jenny, right, stand on the top of a double-decker bus, I'm going to drive through London at 30 miles an hour, and I want you to jump off the bus.
Well, I probably would do it, but it doesn't make me a very intelligent or thoughtful person.
So you probably wouldn't die, but you would expect to get injured, and that's unfortunately one of the compromises. If you have the parachute too big, if you did eject at, I don't know, 30,000 feet, now the seat's designed not to put the parachute out fully until you're down at below 10,000 feet. But if it was a big parachute, you could end up being really slow coming down. You'd be running short of oxygen and the like. So it's all a compromise, but it's designed to save your life, and it does that. I'm living proof of it. But it is quite a hairy ride, and you normally do get a bit knocked about as part of the process.
Wow. But you have to be on certain height from the ground, isn't it, to be ejected? Because I remember there was some pilots in Ukraine, they died and during training, and while investigations was going on, and one of the sort of like explanation was they were not high enough to be ejected.
So the very early ejection seats, trying, because it's a complicated process. I mean, let's face it, this ejection seat is not that big, but I think they're about £2 million each. They cost a fortune because there's a lot of technology in there. Because the idea is that with modern seats, if I'm sat here on the ground, if I had an ejection seat and I took myself outside, sat on it in the garden, if I pulled the seat, it would take me high enough, so I'd be under the parachute and I would survive to when I hit the ground again. So they're called zero seats because you can be going at zero speed and zero height, and it will still save your life. Now, the early ejection seats weren't as effective as that, and therefore you had to have a little bit of height in order for the process of the ejection to be complete and you be under a parachute. But it's also worth pointing out, if I'm level flight, then I can get out. But if I am vertically pointing downwards and I eject 1 foot above the ground, as the seat's leaving the aircraft, I'll squish into the ground. So it's all about, as well, your rate of descent. And if your rate of descent is too high and your height is low, then the seat can't give you enough time to get under the parachute. And I think the example, so when who was it? Juice. When Juice died, I think he was on one of those missions, and there was a bit of talk that the ejection was in the edge of limits. And unfortunately, for a lot of pilots, if you're flying straight and level, it's normally a problem-free ejection. But if actually you're pointing sideways like that and you eject out sideways, obviously gravity is taking its toll, and you may not get the full benefit of the parachute slowing you down before you hit the ground. I don't know the specific circumstances of Juice's ejection, but I do know that there were suggestions they were outside the seat limits at the time, which is why that even though it appears that there were some of the ejection seats were operated, that didn't work.
Yeah, unfortunately. And you said about this ejection seat, which cost £2 million. Do you think those pilots had the similar seats? Because the jet itself cost $50 million.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty is it's trying to work out when you talk about costs. The trouble is that Russia does a lot of exporting equipment, and it exports its fighter jets, SU-30s, and charges a certain amount for them. What the price of it is compared to what it costs Russia is obviously completely different, because the more aircraft you produce, the cheaper they are, each of them, and therefore the more export customers you can get. It is a benefit to you to have more customers out there. So it's difficult to know the actual price. When it comes to ejection seats, though, Martin Baker has a global reputation for being the best in the world, bluntly. And Russia has never been traditionally very good at the technology side. It's normally very good at fighter jets that are very powerful, very maneuverable, look really good at air shows. But as we said earlier, the modern fighter jets, it's not a knife fight in a phone box. It's not the Tom Cruise thing. It's very unglamorous, 200 miles away from each other, shooting. And if you've got a stealthy aircraft, your enemy can't see you until he gets a lot closer, by which time you've got a missile in the air already, and therefore you're going home. So I suspect, I don't know much about the Russian ejection seats. They won't be any better than the Western seats. Almost certainly they'll be slightly older, but they do a life-saving job. We've seen the Russian jets crash at air shows. We've reported on them crashing in, being shot down in the Ukraine war, and the pilots successfully escaping. I suspect that we don't know the actual circumstances of the Su-30, if it was low, if the missile that took them down caused the aircraft to go out of control, then the pilot may well have ejected outside the seat limits, and that could have been why they passed away.
Is it true that it's actually two pilots in one jet, right? And why we need two pilots in those war machines?
Yeah, so if you go back, I mean, it's a really good question. One of the main issues is that the role of a fighter pilot is very difficult. There's a lot going on. It happens very, very quickly, and when things go wrong, they go wrong very quickly. And there's a particular set of skills you need. When I joined the military, of every 100 people who lined up at the recruiting office to try to be a fighter pilot, only one would make it through. And we were very lucky that the guys I served with were incredibly capable individuals, amazingly competent at what they did. But if you are in a very difficult environment like that, the more people you can have in the cockpit to share the workload, the better. The problem is, the more people you have, the more weight you have, the more ejection seats you have to have, the more life support systems you have to have. And of course, the heavier the aircraft is, the more fuel it needs to get around, the more drag it's got, the less. So there are compromises everywhere. And we in the military have had a history, particularly in the Royal Air Force. We have the Lightning air defense aircraft, which was a single-seater, but we've also had Phantoms, Tornadoes, and the like that have been two-seaters. Generally, with the two-seaters, you have a pilot and a navigator. Now, that's a euphemism, really, because it's a pilot and a weapons system operator. But in essence, you're just sharing the workload. That the guy in the front has the stick, up, down, left, right, faster, slower. The guy in the back decides, right, where are we? What are we doing? And manages the complex systems. If you've got a single seat aircraft, then that one person has to do everything. It is interesting that the way that modern jets are going, so the Joint Strike Fighter, which we operate in the UK, and Typhoon are both single seat aircraft. So that's where the compromise is going, trying to make them as light as possible, but using technology, artificial intelligence and the like to minimize the burden on the pilot, to free him up so he's got the most capacity, we call it, as possible in the cockpit. But it is not an easy job, and we do spend a lot of time and a lot of money making sure these pilots are the best they can be.
What's the NATO analog to SU-30? And is they sort of like the jet class 4 plus, 4 plus plus plus, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we don't get. I mean, I wouldn't claim to be an expert, and if we go into details like this, you're going to have your comment section absolutely blistering with people going. I think the thing that's most marked for me is that the older aircraft used to be around a specific role. So, for example, we'd have a Jaguar aircraft that was to do reconnaissance and bombing. When I flew the Harrier, which was close air support, providing support to our soldiers on the ground. We'd have, air defense aircraft. All of these aircraft would have a specific role. The problem with that is it's also quite expensive to have lots of different aircraft doing lots of roles. So the advent more recently has been to have multi-role aircraft capable of doing not only delivering bombs on the ground attack, but also fight other aircraft in the air defense. And that multi-role aircraft is what we have with the Joint Strike Fighter. Typhoon's a bit different. It was originally developed as an air defense aircraft, but halfway through its development, the Cold War ended, and several of the partners didn't think we need just an air defense anymore. So they then decided to make it multi-role. That meant adapting an existing design meant it got a lot more expensive. The individual price got a lot more expensive. And we've ended up with 3 different models of Typhoon. Tranche 1, which is still air defense. Tranche 3, which is the full multi-role. And Tranche 2, which is the sort of middle one in between. And I think what you're seeing with all of these aircraft is a gradual evolution towards a single-seat aircraft that is multi-role. And the one exception, though, I think, is that we've seen some of the Chinese aircraft that are under development at the moment. I can't remember the nomenclature. We did one, J40, whatever, J38, J37. That is two-seater again. And I do think there's still a debate about how do you make sure that the technology and the capability of this very expensive, very competent aircraft, how do you make sure you've got the humans inside it that can actually exploit it to its full capability?
I mentioned today a few times that these super expensive fighter jets used against relatively cheap boats. For me, as a Ukrainian, I see the moment sort of Russians are desperate, which obviously makes me happy. But you probably read it differently, isn't it? Sort of like using super expensive machine against super cheap boats with the risk to be drowned.
Yeah, no, sorry, don't get me wrong. I mean, if we're only going to talk about the Su-30 getting shot down, I think you're right. I mean, it is a huge success story for Ukraine. But unfortunately, I spend most of my time looking at this from a rather grand strategic perspective. Today we have a coalition of the willing in Europe trying to force President Putin into a ceasefire. We've got President Putin turning around and going, no, but I will meet President Zelensky on Thursday this week in Istanbul, a one-on-one. to talk about the war. And Trump suddenly weighs in and forces President Zelensky to go and have that conversation. And grand strategically, if I was a military advisor to President Putin, thank goodness I'm not, but if I was, I'd be telling him to just keep going because he's on the front foot. Russia is winning. And my strategic vulnerability, if I was Russian, would be a risk that America and or Europe would directly get involved in a conflict. Because if they were to do that, Russia will be stopped in a heartbeat. So, and actually, if you were Putin now, you'd be seeing President Trump is moving America away, distancing itself more, getting it focus on China rather than Russia and Europe, and threatening to withdraw support. And even with the support of America and Europe, Ukraine has still struggled. If American support was to go, it also means the future of NATO looks a bit more uncertain. And suddenly Europe is going, okay, what do we do about this? Do we bolster our own defenses because we have whittled down the levels of missiles and bombs that we have in order to support Ukraine? But if Ukraine fell, then a vulnerable Ukraine means a vulnerable Europe. And how do you continue to support Ukraine, or do you bolster your own defenses? So all of those look as if they are factors that are favoring President Putin at the moment, and therefore I don't like it, but it does feel that at the moment Putin is on the front foot in the battlefield, and he's seeing the international community gradually fragment in a way that he couldn't have dreamed was possible. So none of those things, I think, lead me to believe that we're close to getting a peace anytime soon.
If you were a security advisor to President Zelensky, what would you tell him?
Yeah, now that's a lot more difficult to do. I think one of the things that I think President Zelensky has done extremely well is to try and avoid a mass fight. And I would never ever want to criticize Ukraine because these are lots and lots. But there are times when the battle for Bakhmut, for example, there will be books written about that it felt like Ukraine decided to take on Russia in a force-on-force battle. Russia paid a huge price for that, but so did Ukraine. I also think, the foray into the Kursk region by President Zelensky, it is entirely inappropriate to criticize it. But after the event, it will be interesting to see how history books are written about whether that was a positive or whether or not that actually simply split Ukraine's forces and led to a weaker defense of the Donbass, which is where the main focus has lied. I do think if you're looking for ideas for the future, I think one of them is that Ukraine has to keep using technology to its advantage. I think one of the great examples of that is drone technology. We would not be able to provide Ukraine with modern state-of-the-art drones because the security around it wouldn't allow us to do it, but also the testing and the evaluation. Whereas actually sending a box full of bits to Ukraine and Ukraine builds this stuff itself, takes all the risk, has actually proven incredible. And one of the statistics that I heard the other day was that in World War II, in fact, most wars, the biggest cause of casualties has been artillery. In Ukraine now, the biggest cause of casualties is drones. And therefore, by using drones, by capitalizing on the technology that the West can help provide, undoubtedly is having a big impact on Russia's ability to continue forward. And I sense at the moment that Russia is running a bit out of steam. It should do another round of mobilization, but that will cause problems for Putin at home. It looks like the land bridge and Crimea is probably going to be the point at which Putin says, pause, let's regenerate my military and then come back again in a few years' time for the rest. And therefore, how does President Zelensky inflict a huge price on Russia for every step it takes forward? And secondly, how on earth do you convert the conversation into those security guarantees, which I think will be so vital for Ukraine going forwards? I am aware of some of the initiatives that are being considered. which obviously can get quite sensitive. But I haven't yet heard the answer to that. I'm not sure NATO will be the answer, mainly because unless America changes its mind in all of this, I think NATO has been taken off the table. But somehow those security guarantees will be absolutely vital, and it won't be a signature on a bit of paper. You know, the 1994 Budapest memo. You know, I've been given enough of a hard time in Ukraine about that when I was out there. So yeah, but I think those are the areas where Zelensky is going to have to focus on.
You've been in Ukraine a few times. First time when you were on the podcast, there was only plans and you were very excited. Now you've seen it, you've tried it, you sensed it. So what's your thoughts? What's your feelings, emotions, and you've got the flavor of being there.
First of all, I think there's no. I owe you a debt of thanks because you were one of the people who gave me a bit of a hard time about not having been out there. And eventually I went, yeah, I need to, I don't want to go near the front line. I'm too old for that. But actually going out, talking to people, getting a flavor. First of all, you know, a place like Kyiv, it's a beautiful city. Um, and my mother was worried about me going out. And I think because she thought it was going to be like London in the Blitz in the Second World War.
It
When you
can
actually
be.
go out to Kyiv, yeah, but when you actually go out there, it's not like that at all. You know, they are under regular air raids and whatever, but it's not as if half the city's been flattened. It's not like that at all. It's a beautiful city. People are going around their business. A couple of things though, that there are not that many fighting age men on the streets, which strikes you. And when you go to Maidan Square and the area where the flags, I'm because I've spent a lot of time in the military, I do find it very poignant to go to the French military cemeteries and just the poignancy of the quiet, the reflection, and the numbers. I got the same feeling at Maidan Square, and when I went out there most recently, I spent another half an hour in the sunshine just sat and reflecting and getting very emotional because, you know, for every flag is a life, and it just brings the whole price of war really up front and personal rather than. And I did sense there's a couple of things that I found interesting. When I went out last year to Ukraine, one of the many questions I asked people was, how do you view President Zelensky? Because from an international perspective, he seems like an absolute hero. I couldn't find anybody who supported him when I was out there last year. When I asked the same question when I was out there 6 weeks or so ago, I found everybody supported him. And it seemed to be because of the events in the White House, the appalling way that President Zelensky was treated, that seems to have galvanized a lot more support for him. The other thing that I think struck me was that back in my early days of covering this, when I was with Sky, a couple of Ukrainian interpreters would give me a really hard time who'd say, we're going to kick Russia out. This is only a matter of time. Stop being so half empty about this. Now, certainly the most recent visit, there was this sense of weariness, sense of tired. This has gone on a long time. The price is huge. And I got more of a sense that people just went, okay, we need to bring this war to an end. And the sort of conversation around that was, if we have to pay a price for that, then so be it. My only thing, though, I was interviewed by one of the Ukrainian channels, and after the interview, we were still like we are now chatting, and she was a bit downbeat, and I said, "What is it? What are you downbeat?" She said, "Well, if we end up ceding territory to Russia, what's this war been about? What a waste of all those lives." And I picked her up straight away, and I said, "Look, hang on a minute. Back at the start of this war, nobody in the West believed that Ukraine would survive the onslaught. Remember that 40-mile convoy attack on Kyiv? You know, the big Russian, you call it Goliath against the David of Ukraine. Russia's got all of the equipment. Ukraine's got sort of second-rate equipment. It's smaller. What chance would it have? Ukraine has survived. Ukraine has withheld the might of Russia. Yes, it has lost some territory, and it's been an appalling cost. But whatever happens in the future, I'm confident Ukraine will not get subjugated. There will be a proud future for Ukraine, and that will be built on the sacrifice, the courage, and the bravery of every single Ukrainian, whether in the country or outside, who has contributed to that. And I said, so before you start writing off all of these casualties, you are forming the foundations of a proud country going forward. What that looks like, I don't know at the moment, but this sacrifice is not wasted.
Sean, what did you like the most about being in Ukraine? Because I have my suspect what would be, but I hope you will surprise me. Because you've been in Lviv, you sort of like transit to go into Kiev, and a part of obviously as a media personality, as a war expert, you obviously had touch to the normal civilian life. So what is your favorite thing about it?
Well, I'll give you my favorite and I'll give my worst. My favorite moment was going to a wine bar in Kiev. I knew a couple of people from the UK who were Ukrainian who invited me to join them of an evening, and one of them was going to a wine bar. And it felt a bit surreal because this was a beautiful wine bar, drinking Ukrainian white wine, which I hadn't expected to like, but I was expected to be polite about it. But it was absolutely gorgeous. And it just felt like a normal day, and chatting in English, but to the owner, to several people. You got that real sense of actually life. And of course, there's a rich history to the city, which I could barely touch. The worst part of the most recent visit was I was, as a former military guy, I was invited to one of the military air bases, and obviously that's not available to journalists. And because I keep my security clearances, I respect. But I was quite shocked at just how vulnerable these air bases were. Things I took for granted when I was in the military on an air base, the sort of level of defenses, the level of equipment, the level of support that these pilots had, was just a real shock. And part of that is because back in 1918, we formed an independent air force because before that, we'd largely been airborne artillery for my army colleagues, whereas an independent air force is actually how you exploit air power the most effectively, because otherwise just helping a guy who's in a battle down here, if you take out the bridges 30 miles behind the front line, you can stop the next generation of tanks getting there. And that independence of air power is fundamental. And that's why most of the leading air forces in the world have gone down that route. Ukraine has not, and therefore is still being used largely as airborne artillery. And if the Ukrainian forces have got £1,000 to spend, are they going to spend it on a flight suit or a life jacket for a pilot, or are they going to spend it on an artillery round or a bullet for the guys on the front line? It's really clear what they're doing. And it was quite a shock just to see how little support that they had, how little capability they had. And, things like the Air Warfare Centre, which we have back in the UK, that's constantly looking at the threats, how you combat those threats, what the techniques you need, what are the electronic warfare you need, what are the bits of hardware you need to combat threats. None of that is available to our Ukraine colleagues. And I found that very disheartening because it means that you suddenly get a better flavour of why the Ukrainian Air Force, it's very difficult for them to take an active part in this conflict.
Yeah. Why that not so many women among fighter jet pilots?
Well, that's a really interesting story. So I mean, the short answer is we don't attract that many. And even if we did, it costs around about £100 million now for to train a fighter pilot and give them 3 years of frontline experience. So it's huge sums of money. And so in the military, we lock those pilots in for a total of 12 years or 16 years to make sure you get a return on that investment. We can't force females not to have children, and therefore around about the time that people become combat ready and then do their first tour, particularly in the UK, we've had a very slow flying training system. The danger is that time starts to take them into a period where they understandably want to have children. And Obviously, you can't fly fighter jets when you're pregnant because of the risk of the body, and also it takes a bit of recovery afterwards. And purely, it's a lot of people who start a family don't really want to come back to flying military jets again after that. So, but in terms of competence, I was an instructor at RAF Cranwell when we first introduced having female pilots, because at the time we didn't have any of the right facilities, so or whatever. But we sort of made the decision politically we are going to have female pilots, and they recruited a whole load. We were training them, but they not one of them passed the tests that they were put through, and it was a really interesting conversation because we were pulled into a room by our seniors who said, you're going to have to massage the standard here to let some people through. And you can imagine we went absolutely nuts because we said, if you adjust the standards, people will die. And their point was, for me, it's really important point, is that unless you get women pilots, unless you have role models of female pilots in the cockpit, you won't attract the next generation of female pilots. So how do you get the first ones in to be those role models? And you need to do what you need to do to get them to be there. Because we're not talking about suddenly dramatically changing, but recognizing that your training techniques may be focused, ideally optimized for males. Maybe it's a different alien environment, whatever. Anyway, we put those first people through, and it created a lot of bad feeling. When I was a squadron commander some years later, a boss of number 1 squadron at Flying Harriers, we had 2 female fast jet pilots on the squadron, and they were absolutely outstanding. Full question, no question about it. They were every bit as good, if not better, than their male contemporaries. So there's no reason why female pilots can't be fast jet pilots. But the point is that very few of them will actually see their 12, 16 years and continue their time in the cockpit. And therefore, if you were a businessman, you'd have to make a really difficult call about whether it's worth that investment of money, because you're not necessarily going to see the full return of investment. But in answer to your question, we now have full access to female pilots, and they are awesome, very, very good. The question is, how many of them are available to actually see their full term out? That's a difficult one.
Interesting. Because I was about to say, what's wrong with your test? Are you implying that women are not smart enough or not strong enough? But I'm not going to ask those questions.
No, I mean, it's a really good, because it wasn't a test as in sitting there. It was actually doing the flying training. I mean, when I was a flying instructor, I always said I could teach my mother how to fly a jet, but it would take a lot of hours, and you only had a certain number of hours in order to do that. And therefore, but I do think, you have to learn that everybody learns differently. You have different people have different experiences upon which they base their approach to risk and the like. And I think the flying training system needed to adapt to be able to, and it has. That's why we've got a much better flying training system now that isn't just about male, female. It's actually looking at how people learn and how do you get the best out of people. We were largely at the time, this is how you train. You either pass or you fail. Now the training system is deliberately trying to make sure, given it's so expensive, but ultimately, when you do hit the front line, you basically have to cope, because a lot of time you end up in situations that you've never been trained for, and you just got to cope, because that's what it means to be on the front line in a modern fighter jet.
Sean, thank you very much.
Always a pleasure, Jenny.
Thank you for watching. There was Sean Bell, ex fighter jet pilot, and he's one of the top speakers on Ukraine. He's been to Ukraine, and he's one of my colleague podcasters. As I mentioned, I will leave links to his podcast and also to my interview with the Commander Secret Group-13 Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, the group which took down 2 SU-30, and the start of this year, 2025, they took down 2 helicopters, Mi-8. I hope, more exciting news from Secret Group 13 and hope from you like, share, subscribe and share your thoughts. What were your emotions and what did you think when you read the news about this historical moment to SU-30 down to the Black Sea? Thank you for watching. Thank you for finding time to spend it with me and thank you for your support. Means a lot to me. I'm Jenny Klochko. Take care.